The keys hit the bottom of the trash bin with a small metal sound, and, for one full second, nobody moved. Naomi stood on the marble apron of the Valet Grand, a duffel bag over one shoulder and an old set of car keys still warm from her palm a moment before, and she watched the young valet wipe his hand on his trousers as if he had touched something unclean. He had taken the keys from her without looking at her face. He had carried them 3 steps. Then he had lifted the lid of the brass-trimmed waste bin near the revolving door and let them fall, and he had said, without turning around, that the staff entrance for deliveries was around the side. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the bin. Her hands stayed at her sides, and the only thing that moved was a muscle high in her jaw. Once, and then it stilled too. Behind the valet, the lobby of the Valet Grand went on glittering as if nothing had happened. Brass sconces threw warm light across grey marble. A pianist somewhere played something soft. A doorman in a long coat held the door for a couple in evening clothes, and the revolving glass turned, and the city outside glowed amber through tall windows 12 feet high. Naomi looked at the bin. She looked at the back of the young man's neck, and she understood, with a calm that surprised even her, that he believed he had just solved a problem. He had not solved a problem. He had become one. She was not going to tell him that, though. Not yet, and not like that. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. The woman standing on that marble apron in a travel-creased grey coat, holding a duffel bag and a set of keys that were now sitting in the trash, owned the building. She owned the brass bin. She owned the marble he was standing on, and the piano, and the long coat the doorman wore, and the parking structure the young valet thought she was too poor to use. She had signed for all of it 11 months earlier in a glass conference room, 60 floors above this very lobby, and not one person who worked the floor that night knew her face. That is the gap this whole story lives inside. Hold it. We're going to come back to it. Let me take you back. Naomi Adesanya was 41 years old, and she had not always owned hotels. She had been raised in a third-floor walk-up on the east side of a city that does not need to be named by a grandmother named Florence, who cleaned other people's hotels for 31 years. Florence Adesanya rose at 4 in the morning. She wore a pale blue housekeeping uniform with her name stitched in white thread over the heart, and she pushed a cart down carpeted hallways that smelled of other people's perfume, and she made beds for strangers who would never learn her name. Naomi remembered the uniform. She remembered the smell of the starch her grandmother used on the collar, and the way Florence folded the uniform at night over the back of a kitchen chair so it would be ready before dawn. She remembered the small things her grandmother carried home in her apron pocket. A guest had left a paperback. A guest had left a single earring with no match. Once, a guest had left a leather notebook in a nightstand drawer, and the front desk had told Florence to throw it out. And Florence had not thrown it out. She had brought it home and given it to her granddaughter and told her to fill it with everything she ever learned. That notebook still has work to do before we are done. Keep it in mind. Florence used to say a thing at the kitchen table with her swollen feet up on the second chair and a cup of tea going cold in her hands. She used to say that a building does not know who is rich. A building only knows who pays attention to it. She said the people who run a hotel from the top floor sign the checks, but the people who know whether the boiler is dying, whether the night manager is stealing, whether the third-floor ice machine has leaked for a year, are the ones nobody looks at. Florence said the most important person in any building is usually the one holding a mop. And the saddest thing in the world is a company that has forgotten that. Naomi grew up inside those sentences. She did her homework on the floor of a laundromat while her grandmother folded sheets for extra money. She read that notebook so many times the spine cracked, and then she began to fill it. She wrote down how things worked. She wrote down questions and chased the answers across library shelves. She was the kind of child who asked a janitor at her school how the heating system decided which rooms got warm, and then listened to the entire answer, and then wrote it down. She went to a state university on a partial scholarship and a stack of loans, and she studied hospitality, management, and finance, and she worked the front desk of a budget motel by the interstate to pay her rent. She learned the business from the bottom of the bottom. She learned what a tired traveler needs at the worst hour of the night. She learned how a manager who has given up poisons a whole staff. She learned, most of all, that the industry she loved was built on the labor of people it refused to see, and that this was not only cruel, it was bad business. Florence died in the spring of Naomi's 29th year in a hospital bed, still asking whether anyone had remembered to defrost the freezer at the apartment. Naomi held her hand at the end. The grief did not leave her. It changed shape and moved in. She carried it the way you carry a stone, in a coat pocket, the weight always there, your hand always finding it. After the funeral, Naomi took the worn notebook out of the drawer where she kept it, and she made herself a promise that she has never spoken aloud to anyone. She promised her grandmother that she would build something, not for revenge. Florence did not raise her for revenge. She would build something where the woman pushing the cart was the most respected person on the floor, and where nobody ever would throw a person's belongings away because of the coat they wore. It took 12 years. She started with one struggling property in a small city, an 18-room inn that the bank had nearly given up on. She ran the front desk and the books and the boiler herself for the first year. She slept in the manager's office. She turned it around by doing the thing nobody expected, which was treating the housekeepers as the experts they were and asking them what was broken. They told her. She fixed it. The inn filled up. She bought a second property, then a third. She built a small company on a single principle that sounded sentimental on paper and proved itself in the ledger every single quarter. Take care of the people who hold the building together, and the building will hold you. 11 months before the night the keys went in the trash, Naomi's company acquired the Valet Grand. The Valet Grand was a 140-room landmark in the center of a major city, all marble and brass and old money, the kind of hotel that had hosted senators and film premieres and that had over 2 slow decades begun quietly to rot from the inside. The previous owners had let it coast on its name. Occupancy was down, the reviews had turned, and underneath the polished surface, something was wrong with the way the place treated its own people. And Naomi could smell it from the financials alone. She bought it for a price that made her board nervous. Then she did something her board found bizarre. She told no one at the hotel that the ownership had changed in any way they would notice. The acquisition went through a holding company. The general manager kept his job. The staff kept their shifts. And Naomi made a decision that she knew was a risk, the kind of risk Florence would have understood in her bones. Before she fixed the Valet Grand from the top, she was going to see it from the bottom. She was going to walk in as nobody and find out who the place really was. She had done it before, at smaller properties, and it had always taught her more in 3 days than 3 months of reports. She had never tried it at a property this size, though, and she had never tried it where the rot ran this deep. She told exactly one person her plan. His name was Marcus Hale, and he was the new regional director she had hired 6 months earlier. A careful, decent man who had come up through the industry the same hard way she had. Marcus thought the plan was dangerous. He told her so. Then he agreed to be the one phone call she could make if she needed the truth confirmed, and he agreed to keep her secret, and he kept it. So on a cold evening in late autumn, Naomi Adesanya put on a travel-creased grey coat and a pair of sensible flat shoes, picked up a battered duffel bag and the keys to an ordinary rented sedan, and drove to the front entrance of the hotel she owned. She had a reservation under a different name. She intended to check in, stay 3 nights, eat in the restaurant, ride the elevators, and watch. She did not even make it through the door. The valet's name was Kyle. He was 23, and he wore the crisp burgundy jacket of the Valet Grand Valet team with a brass keypin on the lapel. He had a way of standing that he had clearly practiced. Weight back on his heels, chin up, eyes scanning the curb for the cars that mattered. A black town car had just pulled up behind Naomi's rented sedan, and a man in a $1,000 overcoat was stepping out of it, and Kyle's whole body had already turned toward the better tip. He had glanced at Naomi's sedan. He had glanced at her coat. He had made his calculation in under 2 seconds, and the calculation was that this woman was not a guest, and that the fastest way to make her stop being his problem was to point her at the service entrance and move on to the overcoat. When she had held out her keys and given her reservation name, he had not heard a guest. He had heard an inconvenience. He had taken the keys to make her go away, and then, rather than walk them to the valet stand, he had simply dropped them into the brass waste bin and turned to the town car, because in his mind there was no car of hers worth parking. Naomi watched all of this happen, and the thing that struck her, standing there, was not anger, though the anger was there, banked low and steady the way Florence had taught her to hold it. The thing that struck her was the sheer ordinariness of it. This was not a monster. This was a young man who had been trained by someone, by a whole culture inside this building, to read a person's worth off their coat in 2 seconds and act on the reading. Somebody had taught him this. Somebody above him had made this normal, and that somebody was the person she had actually come to find. She bent, calmly, and lifted the lid of the brass bin and reached in past a discarded coffee cup and took back her own keys. She wiped them on a tissue from her pocket. Kyle, busy with the overcoat now, did not even notice. Then she walked into the lobby of her own hotel, past the pianist and the warm sconces and the 12-foot windows, and she went to the front desk and she checked in under her reservation name, and the night clerk gave her a key card without ever once looking up at her face. The man she had come to find was named Dalton Frey, and he was the general manager of the Valet Grand. Naomi met him for the first time the next morning, though he did not know who he was meeting. She had asked at the desk to speak with a manager about a billing question, and after a 40-minute wait in a stiff lobby chair, she was brought to a small office off the mezzanine where Dalton Frey sat behind a wide glass desk with nothing on it but a closed laptop and a cup of coffee. Frey was 53, he wore a charcoal suit that fit him beautifully and a watch that cost more than the night clerk made in 2 months. He had silver hair combed back from a high forehead and the unhurried confidence of a man who had run elegant buildings for 30 years and had stopped, somewhere along the way, seeing the people who cleaned them. When Naomi walked in, he glanced up, took in the grey coat, and gestured to the chair across from him with 2 fingers. The way you might wave a fly toward an open window, she asked her billing question, which was minor and invented. He answered it without warmth and without error, and then because she wanted to see how deep it went, she mentioned, mildly, that she had a small problem with a valet the night before. She said her keys had ended up in the trash. She did not say she had watched it happen on purpose. She let it sound like an accident to see what he would do with it. What Dalton Frey did with it told her everything. He did not apologize. He smiled a small, practiced smile, and he said that the valet team was extremely professional and that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about where guests should leave their vehicles. He said the staff entrance was clearly marked. He said it in a tone so smooth and so certain that for half a second, even Naomi, who knew exactly what she had seen, almost doubted herself. That was the skill of the man. He could take an injustice and sand it down into a misunderstanding and hand it back to you, polished and make you feel you had been unreasonable to mention it. She thanked him and left. She rode the elevator up to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and took out the leather notebook, her grandmother's notebook, soft at the corners now, and she began to write down what she had learned. She wrote that the rot was not Kyle. The rot was the smooth man with the glass desk who had built a building where Kyle's behavior was the natural outcome and who would defend it with a smile every time, because to admit it was a problem would be to admit that he was the problem. Here is the moment a person might have expected her to reveal herself. She had the power. She owned the building. She could have stood up in that office, said her name, and watched the color drain out of Dalton Frey's face. It would have felt good for about 4 seconds. She did not do it. And the reason she did not do it is the whole reason her grandmother had raised her the way she did. If she revealed herself, the change would last exactly as long as her attention did. Frey would scramble. He would fire Kyle to protect himself. He would put on a show of reform for the owner, and the moment she looked away, the building would settle back into exactly what it had been, because nothing real would have changed. The people who had been invisible would still be invisible. They would just have watched one rich woman frighten one manager for one afternoon. Florence had not raised her to frighten people. Florence had raised her to fix buildings. So Naomi made a different decision. She decided to stay invisible a little longer and to find out who, inside the Valet Grand was already holding the place together in spite of Dalton Frey. Because in every rotting building there is always someone. There is always one person who keeps doing the work right when no one is watching and no one is rewarding it, and that person is the foundation you rebuild on. She found her on the third night in the staff break room at 2 a.m. Naomi had not been able to sleep, and she had gone walking through the back corridors of her own hotel. The parts guests never see, where the marble gives way to scuffed linoleum and the brass gives way to a long, humming row of fluorescent lights. She had pushed open the door of the staff break room expecting it to be empty. It was not. A woman sat at the laminate table with a thermos of tea and a thick 3-ring binder open in front of her. She was in her early 60s, small and straight-backed, in a grey housekeeping uniform with a name badge that read Bernadine. She had short silver-grey coils and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she was making careful notes in the margin of a maintenance log with a pencil she kept sharpening with a small blade. Naomi froze in the doorway. For one disorienting second, she was 9 years old again, watching her grandmother work at the kitchen table after a 16-hour shift. She almost said Florence's name out loud. Bernadine looked up over her glasses, unbothered. She said the break room was for staff, but that the coffee was free and the new arrival looked like she needed some. Naomi said she could not sleep. Bernadine nodded as if that explained everything, and went back to her binder, and after a moment Naomi sat down across from her, the way you sit at a kitchen table, and asked what she was working on at that hour. What Bernadine was working on, it turned out, was the truth. For 11 years Bernadine had run the overnight housekeeping floor of the Valet Grand, and for 11 years she had kept her own private record of everything management refused to fix. She had a binder. She had it organized by floor and by date. She had logged the boiler on the 4th floor that had been failing for 3 winters, throttled down each season to save on a repair, so that the guests on that floor were always cold and always complaining and never told why. She had logged the overtime that the night staff worked and were never paid. Hours quietly shaved off the records by a payroll system Frey controlled. She had logged the supply orders that came in short, while the invoices came in full. She had, without ever using the word, documented years of small thefts and small cruelties. In pencil, alone, on a floor, no executive ever walked. She had reported it. Of course she had reported it. She told the woman across from her, in the flat voice of a person long past expecting to be believed, that she had taken her concerns to Mr. Frey twice. The first time he had thanked her and done nothing. The second time he had moved her from the day shift she had held for 9 years to permanent overnights, and reminded her gently that loyal employees did not make trouble. He had not fired her. Firing her would have looked like retaliation. He had simply made her invisible, moved her to the hours when no guest and no executive would ever cross her path, and let her understand that her binder was a hobby that could cost her job. Naomi listened to all of it without saying who she was. It took everything she had. There was a moment when Bernadine described being moved to overnights as punishment for telling the truth, that Naomi's hand went into her coat pocket and closed around the worn cover of the notebook, hard the way Florence used to close her hand around a cup of cooling tea. She held the weight. She kept her face still. She asked Bernadine one question. She asked why, after all of it, after being ignored and demoted and made invisible, she kept the binder. Why keep documenting a thing nobody would ever read? Bernadine took off her reading glasses and looked at her for a long moment. She said that her own mother had cleaned buildings, and that her mother used to tell her a building does not know who is rich. A building only knows who pays attention to it. She said she kept the binder because one day somebody who actually owned this place was going to want to know the truth, and when that day came, the truth was going to be ready, written down, with dates, so that nobody could sand it into a misunderstanding. Naomi sat very still. Across a city and across 30 years, her grandmother's exact words had just come back to her out of a stranger's mouth, and she understood that she was not the only person Florence's kind of woman had ever raised. There were women like Florence in every building in the world, keeping the truth in pencil at 2 a.m, waiting for someone to finally ask. She did not reveal herself even then. She made Bernadine one promise, though, carefully worded, so it was not a lie. She said that she had a feeling somebody was going to ask for that binder very soon, and that when they did, Bernadine should not be afraid to hand over every page. Bernadine looked at her for a long moment, then closed the binder and said she was not afraid. She said she had stopped being afraid years ago. Fear, she said, was for people who still had something to lose, and they had taken everything from her but the truth. And the truth they could not take. Naomi went back up to her room and did not sleep at all. She lay on top of the covers in the dark with the notebook on her chest, and she made her plan, and the plan was not revenge. The plan was a reckoning, which is a different thing. Revenge tears a thing down. A reckoning sets it right and makes sure it stays right. In the morning she made one phone call. She called Marcus Hale, her regional director, the one man who knew who she was. She told him what she had found. She told him about the boiler and the shaved overtime and the short supply orders and the binder and the woman who had kept it. She told him about Kyle and the bin, which she now understood was not the story but the symptom. And she told him to begin quietly a full forensic audit of the property's payroll and maintenance and supply records going back 5 years, and to do it through the holding company so that Dalton Frey would not see it coming until it was already done. Then she did the hardest thing. She checked out of the hotel as the anonymous guest, and she let Dalton Frey win. For 3 weeks, nothing happened that Frey could see. He ran his beautiful building. He defended his valet team. He moved smoothly through his marble lobby and never once thought about the woman in the grey coat whose keys had gone in the bin, because she had been, to him, nobody. And nobody does not stay in the mind. The audit, however, was running. Marcus Hale and a team of 3 forensic accountants were pulling the building apart from the inside, quietly, through the books. And Dalton Frey, who was a careful man and a guilty one, began to feel it before he could name it. A request came down for 5 years of payroll records. A second request came for the maintenance logs. He did what guilty, careful men do. He started to defend himself. Watch closely now, because what Frey did next is what makes the ending mean something. Dalton Frey did not panic and confess. He fought. When the audit asked for the 4th floor boiler maintenance records, Frey produced a clean set showing the boiler had been serviced every year, signed and dated. They were forgeries. He had a contact at the maintenance contractor who, for a consideration, backdated service tickets for boiler work that had never been done. When the audit asked about the overtime discrepancies, Frey produced signed timesheets showing the overnight staff had been paid in full. Timesheets the staff had never seen, with signatures that were not quite their signatures. He had spent years building a building that looked clean on paper, and now he defended it the way he had built it, with documents, with smooth explanations, with a forger's patience. He was not a stupid man. He was a formidable one. If the audit had been all there was, he might well have survived it. A clean paper trail beats a suspicion every time. The audit was not all there was, though. The audit had Bernadine's binder. When Marcus Hale's accountants came on site to do their review, Frey was ready for them. He was charming. He produced his clean records. He explained the boiler maintenance and the timesheets in his smooth, certain voice, and for a day and a half it looked like the paper would hold. The forged service tickets matched the forged timesheets. The story was airtight. Then the lead accountant asked, almost as an afterthought, whether any staff member kept independent maintenance records. Frey said, no, of course not. Why would they? And Marcus Hale, who had been briefed, said that he understood the overnight housekeeping supervisor had kept a maintenance log and he would like to see it. They sent for Bernadine. She came up from the overnight floor in her grey uniform, small and straight-backed, with her 3-ring binder under her arm, and she set it on the glass conference table in front of the accountants and the regional director and Dalton Frey, and she opened it. And the building's real history, the one written in pencil on the overnight floor when no one else was awake, lay down beside the forged one. The boiler that Frey's ticket said had been serviced every autumn. Bernadine's log showed had failed 3 winters running, with the dates, with the room numbers of the guests who complained, with the exact temperature she had measured on the 4th floor each January, with a thermometer she had bought herself. The overtime Frey's timesheet said had been paid. Bernadine's log showed in the names and hours of the people who had actually worked it. cross-referenced against the dates the building had been at full occupancy and short-staffed at the same time, which was not possible unless the overnight crew had worked hours that were never on a record Frey would admit existed. You did not need to be an accountant to see it. You needed only to lay the two records side by side. One was a building's truth and one was a building's alibi, and they could not both be real, and the truth had dates and a thermometer and the names of living people, and the alibi had a forger's signature. Dalton Frey looked at the binder on the glass table, and for the first time in 30 years, his smooth certainty failed him. He looked at Bernadine, the woman he had moved to overnights to make invisible, the woman he had decided years ago was a hobbyist with a grievance, and he understood far too late that she had not been a problem he had solved. She had been a witness he had created. Every cruelty he had used to silence her, the demotion, the overnight shift, the gentle reminders, had only given her more nights alone with her binder to write it all down. He had spent 11 years building the very testimony that was now going to end him. He tried, even then, to fight. He said the housekeeping log was unofficial. He said a disgruntled employee could write anything in a binder. He said it would not hold up. His voice had gone tight, and his hands, which had been so still all his life, had begun to move. And here is the thing he had never planned for, because he had never once imagined it was possible. The door of the conference room opened, and a woman walked in, and she was wearing a travel-creased grey coat and sensible flat shoes, and she was carrying a soft-cornered notebook, and Dalton Frey's whole body went cold before his mind even caught up, because some animal part of him recognized her from a curb 3 weeks ago. A nobody whose keys had gone in the bin. Marcus Hale stood and said her name. He said it was his privilege to introduce the owner of the property, the principal of the holding company, the woman whose signature was on the deed to the building they were all sitting in. He said it the way you say a name that is about to change everything in the room. Naomi Adesanya. Frey did not speak. He could not. He stared at the grey coat, and you could watch the past 3 weeks rearrange themselves behind his eyes. The anonymous guest with the billing question. The keys in the bin. The woman he had waved into a chair with 2 fingers. The nobody. He had performed his contempt for the owner of the building to her face and never known it, and now the knowledge of it arrived all at once and took the colour out of him. Naomi did not gloat. She had promised her grandmother she would not, and she did not. She set her grandmother's notebook down on the glass table next to Bernadine's binder, 2 records kept by 2 women who cleaned buildings or were raised by women who did, and she let them sit there side by side for a moment so that everyone in the room could see they were the same kind of object. Then she spoke, and her voice was quiet and even, and she did not raise it once. She did not talk about the keys. She told Frey that she had stayed 3 nights in his building as a guest, and that in 3 nights one of his employees had taught her more about how the place really worked than he had in the 40 minutes he had given her across his glass desk. She told him that she had come to his hotel expecting to find what was broken, and that she had found it and that it was not the boiler. She turned to Bernadine then, and she did the one thing this whole story had been moving toward from the second the keys hit the bottom of the bin. In front of the accountants, in front of Marcus Hale, in front of the man who had spent 11 years making this woman invisible, the owner of the building named Bernadine's worth out loud. She said that for over a decade, while management collected the salary, this woman had done the actual work of protecting the place for no thanks and at real cost to herself, and that the building was standing as well as it was standing because of her, and in spite of the man who ran it. She said it plainly, as a fact, the way you state a number that is simply true. Bernadine, who had stopped being afraid years ago, who had told a stranger in a break room that the truth was the one thing they could not take, sat very still while Naomi said her name with respect in front of the people who had ignored it. She did not cry out or break down. Her hands, folded on top of her binder, tightened until the knuckles paled, and she had to look down at the table for a moment, and a single line of wet ran down beside her nose, and she let it. She had waited 11 years for someone who owned the place to want the truth. She had said somebody would come. And somebody had come. What happened to Dalton Frey was not a shout. It was a structure. He was not dragged out of the building. Naomi did not give herself. The satisfaction. Way. The audit's findings, the forged service tickets and the falsified timesheets were referred to the proper authorities because forging payroll records to steal wages from working people is not a private matter to be settled with a handshake, and the stolen wages were repaid with interest to every member of the overnight staff who had earned them and never been paid, calculated to the dollar from the very records the forger himself had unwittingly preserved. Frey was removed from his position that day. The smooth voice, the glass desk, the watch that cost 2 months of a clerk's pay, none of it followed him out the door. The thing he had done to Bernardine was done to him in the end, not out of cruelty, but out of simple consequence. He became a man no one in that building had any reason to look at anymore. The invisibility he had handed out for 30 years came home and sat down on him, and the place moved on without missing his step. Kyle the valet was a different matter, and how Naomi handles him is the part I most want you to carry with you. She did not fire him. She could have, easily, and no one would have questioned it. Naomi had stood on that curb, though, and understood, even in the moment, that Kyle was not the disease. He was the symptom of a building that had taught 23-year-old to read a human being's value off a coat. The man who had taught him that was gone now, and Naomi believed, because Florence had taught her to believe it, that a person who has been trained wrong can be trained right if someone is willing to do the work. She had Kyle brought to the staff break room, the one with the laminate table and the humming lights, and she did not tower over him or lecture him. She had him sit. She told him who she was, and she watched the same cold understanding move through him that had moved through Frey, the memory of the keys, the brass bin, the woman he had not seen. He started to apologize, fast and frightened. She stopped him. She told him she did not want an apology she had scared out of him. She wanted him to do something instead. She told him that for the next month, before any other shift, he would spend 2 hours each morning working the overnight housekeeping floor alongside Bernardine. He would push the cart. He would learn the building from the inside, from the boiler room to the laundry, from the woman who knew it best. And at the end of the month, he could decide whether he still wanted to be a person who threw a stranger's belongings away, and she would decide whether she still wanted him at the property. He did the month. What happened to Kyle over those weeks was a quieter matter than the rest of it and belongs to him, and he did it. And at the end, he asked to stay on the overnight floor, and Bernardine, who got to make that call now, said he could. Because here is the thing Naomi did that no audit and no firing could have done. Before she left, she promoted Bernardine. Not to a token title. She made her the operations director of the entire property, the person every department now answered to, the person who decided who got hired and who got trained and what got fixed first. The woman who had kept the building's truth in pencil through 11 years of nights was given the authority to run the building in daylight. The grey uniform stayed in her closet. She had earned the right to it, and she wore it sometimes on purpose on the floor so that every new hire would know that the woman in charge had pushed the cart, and that in this building, of all the buildings in the world, the person holding the mop was somebody you looked at. The boiler on the 4th floor was replaced before the first frost. The overtime was paid, the supply orders were audited and corrected. And the brass bin by the revolving door, the one Naomi's keys had landed in, was still there because she left it there on purpose. A small private thing only, she understood. A reminder of how close the most important truth in a building can sit to the rubbish, and how easy it is to throw it away if you have decided in advance that it is worth nothing. Naomi Adesanya went back to her other buildings and her quiet life and the leather notebook with the cracked spine. She had not raised her voice once. She had not thrown anyone's belongings anywhere. She had simply refused to do the one thing the whole building had been built to make people do, which was to look at a person and decide, off a coat and a car and a tired face, that they did not count. Here is what I want you to sit with now that you know how it ended. The valet thought the woman at the curb was nobody. He was wrong about her in the most dramatic way a person can be wrong, and that is the part that makes a satisfying story. The deeper truth is the one Bernardine lived, though alone, for 11 years at a laminate table. There are people all around you right now holding buildings and families and whole institutions together with their attention and their care, getting nothing for it, and being moved to the overnight shift for telling the truth. They are not waiting to turn out to secretly own the place. Most of them never will. They are simply doing the work right because it is right, and writing the truth down in pencil in case anyone ever wants it. The question is not whether you would recognize the secret owner of the hotel. Anyone would once they saw the deed. The question is whether you would have seen Bernadine at 2 in the morning before anyone told you she mattered and pulled out the chair and asked her what she was working on. That is the only test that ever counted. And Naomi passed it in a break room, half by grief and half by grace, because a woman named Florence taught her, a long time ago, that a building does not know who is rich. It only knows who paid attention to it. If something in here moved you, sit with it a moment before you move on and think of the one person in your own life who has been holding something together while no one looked. You already know their name. That is the whole story. Go and say it to them.